Welcome to Asia Pacific Defense Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. I feel I should start this episode with sirens blaring or something like that because I believe the Western world, including Australia, is facing an unprecedented international relations crisis, with the US seemingly swapping sides to support Russia in the war against Ukraine. This is certainly the worst set of circumstances, the worst betrayal I have seen in my lifetime. But when we look at the media in Australia and politicians, no one seems to be aware of what's going on. And I guess it's unfortunate that at the moment we have floods in northern New South Wales and Queensland as a result of the ex-tropical cyclone. But honestly, when I look at the saturation coverage, no pun intended, that I see on the ABC, I think it is completely ridiculous and so over the top. It's a level of parochialism that is now well beyond a joke. I often keep the ABC on in the background in the hope of seeing an Andrew Green report, even though it's the 8th rerun of the day. But every time I've been switching the TV on in the last week, there has been virtually nothing but rain, floods, winds, that sort of thing. And I'll give a bit of gratuitous advice right now to the Prime Minister. Stay away. I know an election is coming up, but you and your entourage blundering around Queensland just slows things down. Stay in Canberra. Do your commentary from here. And by the way, calling a full-on press conference because some Australian soldiers were injured, I think is unnecessary. Calling them Australian heroes, I think is just a bit too far. I'm sure that members of the SES are injured all the time, and they are there because they want to be there, not because they're being paid to be there. If you want to act tough in the lead up to the federal election, stand up to Donald Trump and his appalling behaviour, and just a touch of that will see your personal popularity ratings improve dramatically. Now, what's happening with the US and Russia is unprecedented. It's not just a rogue president. It goes much deeper than that. This, by the way, is a trend that's been underway for quite a few years. I just didn't expect the dam to break this rapidly, and basically with the full support of the US Republican Party, and even people like Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who just a few weeks ago was a Russia hawk, has now turned into a whining anti-Ukraine lickspittle. By the way, Canada is being drawn into this mess, and I'll have a few things to say about that shortly. So where is the rules-based order that Australian politicians are so fond of talking about when Trump is now openly supporting a Russian takeover of Ukraine, basically telling a sovereign nation with a democratically elected president that they can't win and that they should give up? This, for me, is as horrifying and disruptive as 1939 and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, when Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union divided up Eastern Europe between them. And I should know because my ancestral homeland of Estonia was given to Stalin as part of the deal, and my parental grandfather was one of thousands to be deported to Siberia and was never seen alive again. So if I occasionally seem a bit passionate about all of this, you have an indication of why, because history is repeating itself, except this time Eastern Europe is being divided up by Trump and Putin. And if Australian politicians shrug their shoulders and say, well, so what? Just wait until Trump and China's President Xi decide how they want to carve up this part of the world. Now, almost as an aside, the US also seems to be pressing ahead with an utterly bizarre plan to ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip, bulldoze everything and build luxury condominiums there instead, without regard for the 2 million Palestinians who live there. And again, I just wonder where Australian politicians are continuing to blindly line up behind the US. I find the head-in-the-sand attitude of Australian politicians and the media to be beyond frustrating, because the Australia-US special relationship, which typically only exists in the minds of Australians, is over. It's finished. It is no longer valid because the US has been demonstrating in the last few days that they are no longer a dependable ally. The situation with Ukraine has worsened because the US has outrageously cut Ukraine off from intelligence information, including early warning of missile launches from Russian territory. Missiles and glide bombs have been hitting Ukrainian cities, including the capital, Kiev. When Donald Trump was asked about this, he almost seemed happy with the prospect. So what's difficult to understand about this situation? It's being played out in front of us, in the media, in real time. This is like some sort of failed marriage, where Australia is pretending everything is fine, when the other party has packed their suitcase, taken the car, found a new place to live, are with their new partner, opened their own bank account and have hired a top divorce lawyer. I mean, what is there not to understand? But here we are pretending everything is normal. Well, actually, worse than that, speaking at a security conference in Adelaide last Wednesday, a senior Trump nominee, Elbridge Colby, he is the nominee for the Undersecretary of Defence policy position, the number 3 post in the Department of Defence. He said Australia should lift its defence spending to around 3% of GDP, up from the current 2%. And get this, our big, brave, independent Defence Minister Richard Marles basically said, OK, if that's what the US wants, I guess we should do it. All I can say is that Mr. Marles must really enjoy the taste of US bum, because that is the most cringe-worthy, sycophantic attitude of any Australian minister I have seen ever. And to my surprise, a few days later, on the opposition side of things, Jane Hume, their finance spokesman, said pretty much the same thing. Oh, well, the US wants us to lift to 3%, so we'll have to do that. Well, what if the US doesn't like our Prime Minister? Do we say, oh, OK, well, we'll get rid of him or her and put a more suitable person in place? I am genuinely disgusted by this sort of behaviour. It's probably not coincidental that you can't find those remarks that I've just attributed to Richard Marles on the minister's website. You can thankfully Google them, because a couple of days later he has actually been contradicted gently by our normally invertebrate Prime Minister, who did actually say Australia will decide what the defence budget should be. I'm not a psychologist, but it is very clear that Trump and his enablers are moral nihilists. They don't care about other people's lives. They don't care about Ukraine. They don't care about Australia. They have some sort of nasty, nativist, race-based vision of American exceptionalism, and everything is now transactional. What's in it for us? Please, Australian government, wake up to this new reality. It's not easy. I know many people have gone through their entire lives having this faith that the United States will always be there for us. I'm not one of those, by the way. Now, Europe is reacting with speed. Britain, for example, is immediately going for a boost in defence expenditure to 3% of GDP, not like us in some distant future time, but right now. And in another extraordinary move, France has announced publicly that it is prepared to use its nuclear weapons to shield all of Europe, because the United States can no longer be trusted to do so. This is, I find, an absolutely extraordinary development that has received, to the best of my knowledge, zero coverage in Australia, because all that most of our journalists are capable of doing is asking about the date of the federal election. And before entirely leaving Mr. Elbridge Colby, he has previously said he is sceptical about AUKUS Pillar 1, And he said this week he is worried about selling submarines to Australia could leave US sailors vulnerable because the vessels won't be in the right place in the right time. He was speaking in the context about a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And his latest foray back in the US has to tip another bucket of cold water on AUKUS, saying that the sale of Australian submarines under those circumstances would be doubtful. But, of course, you won't hear any of that here, with the latest being $480 million now going to some sort of nuclear submarine training centre at Osborne. Let's go a little bit more to the shocking US treatment of Ukraine and Canada, the latter having received zero attention here. Not only has the US cut off the delivery of supplies to Ukraine, missiles, ammunition, spare parts, possibly even Australia's donated Abrams tanks, but as I say, even more outrageously, Trump has cut off the supply of vital intelligence that allowed Ukraine to prepare for incoming ballistic missiles. There is one thing that Australia could do now that would help address that problem: dispatch one of RAF's E-7C Wedgetail early warning and control aircraft to Europe. One was there a couple of years ago. It was a 6-month deployment. It was highly successful. Offer to do the same thing again. Now, as well as cutting off intelligence and suppliers, on top of that, it looks like Trump will expel around 200,000 Ukrainian refugees from the US so they can be sent home so the Russians can bomb and shell them. It's a total, appalling betrayal. This, of course, is the dominant news in Europe, but not here, as we watch endless coverage of rain and wring our hands that the people of Lismore have been without power for a few hours, as upsetting and inconvenient and tragic as all of that is. And I wonder how the people of Lismore would feel if they were on the receiving end of ballistic missiles and glide bombs targeting schools and hospitals, killing dozens of people every day. Now, let's talk about the Trump administration's disgusting treatment of Canada. I shouldn't have to remind people, but Canada is an Australian ally, a member of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing community, and basically decent country with all of the normal values. Trump has singled out Canada for some special treatment, by which I mean a trade war with rising tariffs. The view from Canada is that these measures are designed specifically to wreck the economy so that Canada has no choice but to become the 51st US state. Now, people in Australia might find this completely improbable, but it's not me saying this. It's not even some excitable Canadian journalists or some analysts. That's the official view of the Canadian government. That's from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and also the very impressive Foreign Minister Melanie Joly. And you can watch her interview with Christian Amanpour on CNN. It only lasts about 12 minutes. It's free. Check it out. You see, the US is not only attacking Canada with high tariffs, they've been temporarily deferred, and that's completely unjustified, by the way, that there's no rationale for that whatsoever. But Trump is also threatening military cooperation. He's saying that he wants to review the border between the two countries and is even considering kicking Canada out of the Five Eyes community. It's outrageous. It's disgusting. And it's wrong. But where is our government? Why are they not expressing support for Canada? Now, this is what I would like to see happen. And as I mentioned before, I'm not a fan of megaphone diplomacy, except where everything else has failed. But since Defence Minister Richard Marles is so friendly with his US counterpart, Pete Hegseth, he should pick up the phone and say very politely, your treatment of Ukraine is appalling, especially cutting off intelligence, and if that isn't reversed within a week, we are suspending the operations of the Pine Gap Joint Intelligence Facility. If you keep up this assault on Ukraine and Canada, we will suspend AUKUS and start exploring the possibility of acquiring nuclear-powered submarines from France. It seems to us that you are no longer interested in the rules-based order, but we are. We also believe in supporting our allies and friends, especially when they are invaded by Russia, a country that obviously has no interest in any peace agreement ever. From what we can see, your president is acting like a Russian asset, and that causes us great concern. And if it were me, I would continue to really make the point. There are a few more measures we can take. We can cancel the purchase of C-130Js and buy C-390s from Brazil instead. We will cancel the purchase of HIMARS and buy rocket artillery from South Korea. We will work with South Korea to develop our own low Earth orbit satellite-based command and control network. We don't want to do any of these things, but the actions of the United States against Ukraine and Canada are completely wrong and need to be reversed. And I continue. For guided weapons, we will work with Japan and South Korea. We do have alternatives. It's not going to be easy, but the behavior of the United States has undermined the fundamentals of the relationship. And until you can prove to us that things are back on an even keel, we're going to go our own way. By the way, Canadians are so alarmed that there's even been speculation that the F-35s they are receiving might have an off switch somewhere in the software that the US could disable all of them at the press of a button. Which, actually, that's enough of the stuff about Ukraine, but that raises an interesting question. When military hardware and software is sold, is it possible that it would have an off switch? And that's something that I and many others have often thought about. Certainly for the F-35s, the US owns all of the intellectual property and also controls all of the software. I'd say from a technical point of view, yes, it's hypothetically possible that in the source code you have a whole lot of ones and zeros, and so you could bury something in there that it would be close to impossible to discover, but not entirely impossible. That's why I think it wouldn't happen, because any company or any government that was discovered, found out to be doing that, they would lose all of their international market in one fell swoop. If other customers realize that, you're buying a product that could be switched off, then obviously they wouldn't risk doing so. What I think is much more likely, and this comes back to my own experience when I was with Thales, back when they were known by a different name, Thompson. Thompson had provided Iraq with an extremely robust air defense system in the 1980s, very robust. In the lead up to Desert Storm in 1990, the US contacted France and said, can you help us disable the network that you have supplied? Now, the situation, as I understand it, a lot of this is still very classified, is that, in fact, there wasn't an off switch somewhere in software. But when you develop a system, you are aware of all of its vulnerabilities and all of its weak spots. And if you're really smart, what you design into the system, which looks quite innocent if they're ever discovered, are little software vulnerabilities that if you know exactly where they are, then you can interfere with the performance of the system from the outside. And that's actually what happened with the Iraqi air defense system. It was rendered useless by, I'll just say, an earlier version of the Stuxnet virus that set back Iran's nuclear weapons program by 5 or 10 years. Okay, that's all I've got time for at the moment. Hopefully the incessant coverage of the weather will stop soon and we'll get a bit of proper news in this country. Thank you as always for listening. Goodbye for now and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.